Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the fifth and final installment in RTD's Aging Well webinar series. My name is Monica Garver, and I'm a senior financial planner at RTD. This series was created to address some of the challenges our clients may face as they themselves or their loved ones enter the latter years of their life. This afternoon, our webinar will focus on recognizing and preventing elder abuse. With us today is Patty Hanson. Patty Hanson is Managing Director and local co-owner of IKOR of Western Pennsylvania. IKOR is a growing national provider offering advocacy and life management services to seniors, disabled, and medically fragile adults and children with special needs. Patty works with a team of highly skilled registered nurse patient advocates, personal needs coordinators, and financial advocates who work collaboratively to support medical and routine living concerns of those they support. Please note that this presentation is educational in nature. We appreciate Patty taking the time to share information pertaining to our Aging Well series. RTD, Patty, and IKOR are not affiliated in any way, formally or informally. RTD's sole purpose in offering this webinar is to provide a means to share information that we feel may be useful to you from other professionals and specialists. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to type any questions you may have, and we will address them at the end. With that, I'll pass things off to Patty for today's presentation.
Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you, Monica, for that kind introduction. I am just getting ready to enter. Okay, so I will, elder abuse is a community issue that everyone needs to be aware of and understand. Today we'll talk about elder abuse, what defines elder abuse. I'll share with you some statistics, demographics, some indicators that you can understand about elder abuse, contributing factors and barriers that cause elder abuse to be rather prevalent in our society, caregiver stress, and how to support a caregiver by addressing caregiver burnout. And then we'll go into sharing how to address elder abuse. Throughout the presentation, I'll share some different stories on cases that we've worked with in this in the area of elder abuse, or what might be considered neglect, to kind of further drive home the theory and the process of the presentation. So an elder in elder abuse is any person over the age of 65. Elder abuse is an act of omission or commission by a person who stands in a trusted relationship that results in harm, threatens harm to the health or welfare of an older individual. And a caregiver is anyone who has the care, custody, control of, or stands in a position of trust with an elder or a dependent adult. So in this, what's good to recognize, it's not even just doing an activity that would harm the health of an older adult or their welfare. It's also acts of omission and not providing care or support for an older adult. So that's an important thing to recognize. According to the best available estimates, between 1 and 2 million Americans over the age 65 or older have been injured, exploited, or otherwise mistreated by someone that they depend on for care and protection. The current estimate puts overall reporting of financial exploitation in 1 in 25 cases, but they also suggest that there may be at least 5 million financial abuse victims each year. Make sure. Nursing home abuse statistics, 1 out of 3 nursing homes across the United States have been cited for nursing home abuse or other related infractions. 11% of nursing homes have been cited for unnecessary dispensing of prescription medications. 1/4 of the aides within nursing homes have been prosecuted for abusing patients and have previous criminal records. So that's, 1/4 of the aides prosecuted for abusing patients have previous criminal records, and 5% of nursing home aides across the nation have criminal records. So it's really understanding that, especially I would say that in Western Pennsylvania, Southwestern Pennsylvania, with our aging adults, it's becoming more challenging for home care agencies as well as nursing homes to find quality individuals to address care-related concerns. There is a shortage of caregivers through in this region and probably across other areas of the United States. So it's just realizing that keeping your eyes and ears open when you're supporting someone or visiting a nursing home or any type of care community, it's important to recognize that there is that it's nursing home abuse statistics are important, but there are other types of care givers, and having a hard time finding people to give care can cause people who are hiring people to hire people that are at a lower standard of what might have been previously acceptable. 1 to 2 million Americans over the age of 65 have been abused, neglected, or mistreated by their primary caregiver. 1 in 10 people over the age of 65 will spend some time of their lives in an adult care facility or a nursing home. An estimated 50% of nursing home patients suffer from pain that's untreated. And in 1999, 5,000 death certificates of nursing home patients listed dehydration, malnutrition, starvation, and bed sores as the cause of death. CNN reports that over 90% of the nursing home facilities are understaffed. These staff shortages lead to increased incidence of health problems, neglect, and abuse. Only 16% of elder abuse cases are ever reported, according to the National Elder Abuse Incident Study. 20% of elder abuse cases involve emotional abuse, 16% involve physical abuse, 3% involve sexual abuse, and 12% involve caregiver neglect. The demographics of an abuser, one of the ways that when I understanding the demographics of the abuser kind of can cause you to, when you see that demographic with an elderly person, the majority of the elder abuse victims are female. So you can understand that if you're supporting a female client, she's at a higher risk to having, to being a victim of elder abuse. And the majority of perpetrators of elder abuse are male. Abusers are most often the primary caregiver. 50% are adult children, and they're and then spouses they determined are 20 to 40%. Males abuse more than females. The abuser is often financially dependent on the victim, and understanding the relationship between the abuser and the victim helps frame the mistreatment on the continuum of domestic violence. So what this is saying, if you have an elderly female client who has often a son who is the primary caregiver, and he lives in the home with her and is financially dependent on her, then that's just like a thought that you can kind of keep in the back of your mind. And you can kind of, as we walk through the different, the ongoing slides, you can kind of take a look or keep your mind open. So, which I mentioned before, financial abuse is an area of elder abuse. I would say in the cases that we work on, 75% of the cases that we tend to work on, I would say, have some sort of financial abuse or some level of undue influence. We became guardian of a woman a couple of years ago whose son wasn't paying the nursing home bill, so they appointed a guardian, and he was paying his child support out of her trust, but he wasn't paying her nursing home bills. So that's an example of elder abuse. Other categories of elder abuse is psychological or emotional. Someone who's undermining a senior or emotionally degrading them. Then there's physical abuse that would consist of, hitting, pushing, not addressing some of their needs. Then there's sexual assault. And sexual assaults are kind of common in nursing homes, but they can be, they can be perpetrated by a trusted caregiver or someone, who visits often. Then there's neglect. Neglect can be active, not giving someone food, not making sure they're eating it, or passive, just leaving someone who can't prepare meals for themselves or get around unattended. And then there's medication, over-medicating someone or stealing their medication, narcotic medication that they need to prevent pain is also another category. And then there is a category called self-neglect if a senior may suffer from dementia, or they're not able to care or manage themselves or manage their home. That can be considered self-neglect. Risk factors for elder abuse. The senior usually has a history of spousal abuse, a complicated family dynamic. There's a level of isolation, or someone tries to isolate the senior so they don't have access to the other person, or the senior person. Troubled relatives, friends, or neighbors. We had a client that had a fentanyl patch for pain, and she was setting out on her porch, and someone in the neighborhood came over to chat with her, and they ripped the fentanyl patch off of her arm and ran off to steal the fentanyl. So, troubled neighbors, families, friends. We've had other incidences where someone gets to know the senior client, recognizes that they have even the smallest amount of money. And we had one gentleman that emailed a trust officer that got access to our client's account or email account, because she gave him the password to help her with something, and he knew she had a trust, and he emailed the trust officer acting as if he was her to try to get access to money from her trust. So the risk factors, there's often some seedy looking characters hanging around. Another risk factor is a caregiver or someone that's living in the home with a senior that really just doesn't have the skills, the capacity, or the ability to support and cope with long-term care. Other risk factors are institutional conditions when someone lives in a care community. Ageism is a big risk factor, lack of knowledge about the aging process. If a young person, 18 to 25, is living with a 90-year-old person and financially dependent, they're not able to see things through the lens and maybe have a good understanding of the aging process and the support that someone needs. A few weeks ago, I received a call from a woman, and I'm not sure how she had my phone number, but she was released from a nursing home, and her nephew picked her up and dropped her off at home. And from her call and talking to her, she really probably shouldn't have been left alone. And she tried to call him to follow up, a couple days later about some things that she needed, and he just blocked her call and sent her to voicemail. So, in that situation, he just didn't totally understand her need or the aging process, or didn't want to be bothered. And our society has become more and more accepting of violence. So that, we as a society and a culture are becoming desensitized to violence and aggressive behaviors. So now we'll go through each type of financial abuse so you can kind of wrap your mind around what financial abuse might look like. An older adult signs a document, a property deed, a will, or a power of attorney without fully understanding or explaining it. We've been involved in situations where a kid, an adult child, got a power of attorney written. It was written by the adult child's attorney and brought to the mom's house, and she was told to sign it. And then later on, over a year's period of time, as another daughter had us become power of attorney, we went through the documents, and we calculated $160,000 had been withdrawn from the account after that document was written. The older adult has a lack of financial choices or decisions. Family members moving in with the older adult saying that they're going to share costs, but there's not a defined lease agreement or something to define the relationship. I had a call a month ago from a daughter-in-law of a woman whose grandchildren had moved into the home. The senior person was living in a back bedroom, and the grandchildren had taken over the home and were bringing seedy characters and smoking weed in the house. So, someone who's living there that doesn't seem to be pulling their own weight. Unexplained discrepancies between known income and the person's standard of living. Unusual bank and ATM activities. Possessions of value disappearing from the home. Utility bill turn off signs. Utility trucks in front of the house. Someone not being able to pay the utilities, or the utilities not being well managed. Indications of psychological or emotional abuse are changes in affect. A senior that was always laughing and fun, seeming solemn and withdrawn. sleep and appetite disturbances. Someone's not sleeping well or saying they're not hungry. Someone just, not pulling away from social contact, not showing interest. Someone who normally was well groomed that has lost interest in caring for themselves. Someone who's apathetic or having some suicidal ideation, saying, "Oh, I would be better off dead. I'm old. I should die." That type of behavior. Evasiveness, anxiety, hostility, notable behavioral changes, fearful, passive, kind of withdrawn, showing low self-esteem, reluctant to talk openly. Sometimes they'll look to the caregiver to speak for them because they don't want to say the wrong thing. Inconsistent statements. Maybe when the caregiver's there, they're talking a different tune and then when the caregiver goes to the bathroom, they say something totally contradictory. Someone who's waiting for the caregiver to respond. Indication of physical abuse, unexplained injuries such as bruising, burns, fractures, or lacerations. Medical attention being sought from a variety of different doctors or clinics. That's often a sign because the doctor's office is going to note if someone's having injuries over and over again. Injuries that haven't received the proper medical attention. Seniors often have a history of accidents and injuries and falls, but information that doesn't seem to add up, multiple injuries, and the injuries are in different stages of healing. A suspicious explanation about an accident and delays in seeking care are also indications of physical abuse. Indications of sexual abuse, a caregiver making sexual suggestions, comments, seeing sexually explicit material or something on the computer or television, lack of personal privacy, watching someone putting cameras in a area that would be private, unnecessary help with dressing and hygiene, unwanted sexual activity, like if a senior's flinching and showing fears of being touched, inappropriate modesty when something's being examined, someone who's taking extra attention to cover the private areas when they're explaining something, bruising on the inner thighs or tenderness, bruising, tenderness, or blood in the private area, bruises on the breast, and unexplained STDs, including HIV. Indicators of neglect can be active or passive, malnutrition, dehydration, weight loss, medical treatment not being withheld, missing dentures, glasses, and hearing aids. That's a big sign. If somebody's hearing aid is missing or they're not wearing glasses, basic life necessities aren't being met, no safety precautions or supervision when it's necessary. If someone's not able to manage their activities of daily living very well on their own, you smell urine in the house, the clothing is torn or uncleaned, or it's not appropriate for the season. There are pressure sores, poor foot care too. A lot of seniors will get sores on their feet, or they're not able to trim their toenails, low body weight, and sometimes it's just the body language of the client that's fearful, or there's something that kind of just gives you an indication of that something just isn't right. I'll tell a story here. A few years ago, I think it's been about 5 years ago now, we were called to support a gentleman that had collapsed in his home. He had gone, his daughter found him. He went into the hospital. His daughter lived at a distance. He went to the hospital. After the hospital, he was discharged to skilled care. And then it was determined that he wasn't able to go back home. So they found a personal care home that would accept his Social Security. And about a year later, his daughter went to visit him, and he had lost an extraordinary amount of weight. And the daughter realized that something needed to get done with the house and the home. And so she called us, and this personal care home was kind of out in a rural area. It was really off the beaten path. And I walked in, and as I was walking down the hallway, there was a community shower with the door open, and there was an elderly lady, probably in her 90s, that was on kind of like a bed or a gurney in this community shower area. And she was all contracted, and she was naked except for being covered with a towel. And, my instincts were like, oh my gosh. And she should have never, she was asleep in there, and she should have never been left unattended in that circumstance. But I moved on and went and met the client and, talked with his daughter. And about 45 minutes later, I was leaving, and that same woman was in that it was still in the bathroom, unattended, sleeping on the gurney, nude, covered up with a sheet. So when I left that personal care home that day, I called aging services to address. I mean, that was a pure sign of neglect. And as I got to know the client that was our client, as we moved through and they hired us to support him and find a new place for him, as we went through his medical records, we found out that he lost over 100 pounds while he was in that personal care home. So self-neglect is also a form of abuse. It's described as a result of an adult's inability to do physical, because of physical or mental impairment or diminished capacity. They're not able to perform essential tasks of self-care, like food, providing themselves with food, clothing, shelter, or medical care. They're not able to obtain goods and services to maintain health and wellness, and they're not able to manage financial affairs for themselves. That's considered self-neglect as a form of self-abuse, and that's also a time that you should be reaching out to your local authorities, which I'll tell you more about later. Indications of over medication, reduced medical or physical activity, a sign of depression, heightened, reduced, or absent therapeutic response, prescriptions not being filled too often, or under medication can be if someone's given narcotics for chronic pain, that they're not being provided to the elderly person as needed. Barriers to disclosing love for the abuser, oftentimes, especially when the caregiver is a child or a grandchild or a family member, the senior loves them, so they don't want to reach out and tell someone. They don't even understand that they're being abused. Shame or guilt, they feel like they kind of deserve to be treated poorly, or they feel guilty, or they're taking on the response of the abuse and kind of thinking that it's their fault. A someone who's not aware of the resources or options and doesn't really feel in control of the situation. They just kind of accept the abuse and neglect as normal, or they're afraid that if they, a senior can be afraid that if I kind of say that I'm being abused by one of my children, what's going to happen to me, and how am I going to continue to live and move forward. Elder abuse is, in some ethnic and cultural communities, is just a normal way of life. Family violence exists in every community and cuts across to all cultures and racial, class, and socioeconomic and religious groups. Sometimes language is a barrier for immigrant seniors. They can be socially isolated, financially dependent, emotionally dependent, and then there's a lot of cultural taboos that seniors and that we struggle with in all different types of abuse and neglect that goes on, not just elder abuse. One of the most important areas of elder abuse can be a result of caregiver stress, and 90% of elder abuses, which I said earlier, are perpetrated by family members. Family members are increasingly stepping up to care for seniors in addition to managing their own daily living responsibilities. Often the caregiver just isn't aware how stressful providing the care is until they've done it for some time, making the matters worse. They don't recognize that there's care out there that exists and where to find it. And chronic stress for caregivers can lead to burnout, which places seniors at risk for elder abuse. If you are, often what I've experienced when it comes to caregiver stress, there's always most often one daughter that lives local that steps up to provide the care for the senior, and other family members kind of tend to judge and do Monday morning quarterbacking of that caregiver, and the caregiver that is local, usually that daughter, sometimes it's the son that cares for the senior person, can just become very overwhelmed with the responsibility and feel burnout. So just being aware of caregiver stress. If you go out on the internet, there's something called a caregiver stress assessment, and it's in PDF format, but a lot of the senior care communities on the web have it there. If you think that a caregiver is showing signs of stress or might need a break, just going out and pulling that caregiver stress assessment off the internet and offering it to them is often can be very supportive and therapeutic for them. Senior caregivers who are having burnout can often be depressed. They can have a negative attitude. They can have a weakened immune system and come down with colds and flu all the time. They just don't lack the enjoyment of things that they formerly enjoyed. They have constant fatigue. They feel hopeless. Sometimes they're isolated or withdrawn. They don't see their friends or participate in community activities like they used to. They're not sleeping well. They're not eating well. And caregivers who are just burnt out and kind of living in survival mode can often seek escapist behaviors like drinking or taking medication and drugs as a way of coping with stress. When you want to support someone or show caregiver burnout, show empathy for the situation, and really just giving them time to vent and get it out of their system offers a lot of help. encourage a caregiver to seek help from professionals. Therapists, social workers, and clergy members are versed in helping with caregiver burnout. In Allegheny County, actually, which is a suburb, or which is where Pittsburgh's located, there's a program called the Caregiver First Initiative that's supported by the United Way. So whenever I meet with anyone in Allegheny County who's a caregiver, I give them that free information. They'll run out, and someone from the Caregiver First Initiative will go to the home, do an assessment, do the caregiver stress assessment, and help the caregiver get support. And many of those programs are available through the Department of Aging. And another way to offer support is to recommend a life care manager or home care to the senior, and even makes or to the caregiver, even makes a call for them. There are programs that can be paid for if people are income eligible through the Area on Aging, which is offered in every county. If you need to address elder abuse, if someone needs immediate assistance, call 911. In the United States, the first response for elder abuse is to call Adult Protective Services. There's the Department of Aging or the Department of Health and Human, which is part of the Department of Health and Human Services for every state, has an office within every county. And if you go online and look for Adult Protective Services or the Department of Aging in your local county, there are lots of resources that they can direct you to, and they will take a statement from you and follow up on any statements that you offer to them about elder abuse or any elder issues. You notice that someone in your neighborhood who's elderly, their mail's piling up, or there seems to be a lot of coming and going from their house from people who you've never seen before. You can also call your Department of Aging, and they will go out and do an assessment and address the needs and help the elderly person get assistance. So at this point, we're going to open up for questions if anyone has any questions.
Thanks, Patty. At this point, I'm not seeing any questions being submitted by the audience. But I think one thing that with your comments, we can all see, we may have misconceived or preconceived ideas of what elder abuse is, but surely elder abuse is really wide in its breadth of abuse. I never thought of things like self-abuse as falling under that category. So given your work in the field, while we maybe allow some time for questions to come in, what would you see as unfortunately, the most prevalent abuse that you encounter?
The things that tend to get brought to our attention more mostly is financial abuse. People, family members that, and I can consider financial abuse passive as well as active. I told you the story about the guy who abandoned his mom in the nursing home and wasn't paying the nursing home bills, but his child support and his living expenses were coming out of his mom's trust. That's active abuse. One of the other areas is passive abuse. We got a call from a power of attorney who lived in Boston, and he hadn't been home for 3 years, and his mom was 95 and had dementia, and his brother lived with mom and had medical issues, and he was taking care of mom, and the house was kind of in disarray. So he asked us to kind of come in, and she had, over $1 million in assets, and he asked us to come in, and his goal was to like get his brother out of the house. And when the house wasn't in good shape, and yes, there was moldy food in the refrigerator, but mom herself was impeccably cared for. She had dementia. She didn't get out of bed that much, but she had no skin breakdown, no bruises. He talked about how she enjoyed eating, and she had a few moments of lucid behavior. And what we suggested was that the power of attorney worked through an attorney to write up a caregiver agreement to allow the brother that was caring for her to get paid, some for caring for the mom, and to bring in some additional caregivers. And the situation that really came down is the brother that was 3 hours away didn't really want to spend mom's money didn't want the brother to get paid because he saw the brother as a freeloader. And
yeah.
The passive behavior of not wanting to spend the parent's money on the care of the parent, I would call elder abuse, because the quality of care and the person's quality of life for not receiving the care because they want to preserve the assets for themselves, to me, that's financial elder abuse.
Yeah, that's a good point. Absolutely. And another situation, a personal situation. I had somebody in a healthcare facility, and in a double room, and the roommate was belligerent and really bothersome to my loved one. And so I addressed it with the administration, and I said, I feel that this roommate situation is an abusive situation to my loved one because it's so disruptive. Was that something that you would have defined as an abusive situation?
Yeah, you know what? So I tend to get upset, and I get on my soapbox because there's a lot of things that are considered neglect, or that might not be considered abuse, might not even meet the needs of neglect. That if we weren't involved in the care of a client, like here's an example. We had this beautiful elderly woman who was on a feeding tube. And as she, after her husband died, we brought in a male caregiver, and he would into the nursing home to kind of take her around and socialize her. Sure. And he would bring his guitar and sing to her. And so, interestingly enough, we kept trying to prompt her to get her hair done, and we were wanting her to get glasses, but she was kind of down in the dumps. And after we brought him in to kind of socialize her more and take her out of her room and in the nursing home, she started to want to do more things and live. And so one of the things that she wanted to do is she wanted to have the opportunity to eat a little for joy. There wasn't any way that she could sustain herself from the feeding tube without the feeding tube, but she just really wanted like a blackberry pie. And so we brought in speech therapy, and we got her swallowing reflexes so she could start eating and a little bit. And one of the things the speech therapist recommended was that that she be given her medications orally. And in the nursing home, but it would require probably 10 or 15 minutes for her to take her medications. Well, what we noticed was within a 6-month period, her feeding tube was becoming blocked, and she was taken to the hospital. And when someone's older and aged, the last thing you want to do is take them to the hospital because they can become exposed to many more germs than they would in the nursing home. So we were concerned that she was being taken to the hospital for her feeding tube being clogged twice in a short amount of time. So our nurse went in every shift, found out what times the meds were delivered, and went in on every shift. And lo and behold, on the evening shift, someone was crushing up her medicine and putting it in the feeding tube because it took too long for her to take her medication. And so that was the issue. And if we, this was a elderly woman whose husband had passed away. If we hadn't been in tune and connected and knew the medical protocols, that, the fact that we had asked them to, and this was a really good nursing home. I mean, they gave her very good care, but often there can just be one person who's doing what's easy instead of doing what's right. And if they, even good nursing homes, there were times that my family would show up on Easter or Christmas that we'd come in, and because they assumed that she wouldn't have any visitors on those days, she was still in her sleeping gown at 10 o'clock in the morning, because they had to spend the time getting ready, getting other people dressed who were, who they knew their family members were coming in. So it isn't, nursing homes are understaffed, and, when you have someone showing up and asking questions on a regular basis, those are the people who get the care and support that they need and deserve. So right. Even though that is considered abuse, it's still, even though it's still something that you just need to be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we are going to go ahead and thank Patty and all of you for participating in today's webinar. We will be providing a recorded copy of today's presentation, and I want to thank you, Patty, for enlightening us on this very important topic of recognizing and preventing elderly abuse. And thank you again all for participating. Have a good afternoon, and bid you all adieu till next time. Thanks, Patty.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.